This is a suppression hearing in the matter of State versus Logan Clegg. I had a brief discussion in chambers with counsel, and it's my understanding the way we're going to progress is we're going to have witness testimony regarding both of the motions to suppress, and then we'll have arguments on the suppression motion, and we'll take up the motion for a remedy.
Thank you, Your Honor. The state calls Lieutenant Marc McGonagle.
Have you raise your right hand. You swear the testimony you're to give in this proceeding is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth under the pains and penalties of perjury?
I swear.
You have a seat and state your full name and spell your last name for the record.
My first name is Marc, M-A-R-C, McGonagle, M-C-G-O-N-A-G-L-E.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, sir. Where do you work?
I currently am employed as a police officer with the City of Concord.
How long have you been with the Concord Police?
I've been with the Concord Police Department for just over 23 years.
Did you graduate from the Police Academy?
I did.
What year?
I graduated from the Police Academy in the year 2000.
What is your current rank within the Concord Police Department?
I am currently a lieutenant.
How long have you been a lieutenant?
I've been a lieutenant since February 2022, so just over a year.
Just briefly, could you summarize what roles have you held with the police prior to becoming a lieutenant?
Sure. I began my career in 2000. I was a patrol officer from 2000 to 2003. At that point in time, I had been transferred to the Criminal Investigations Division, where I worked in an undercover capacity in our drug enforcement unit for about 5 years. From there, I was transferred back to a plainclothes detective in the Criminal Investigations Division assigned to youth services. I worked there for about 5 years or so. From there, I was promoted to sergeant. I was reassigned to the patrol division, where I worked as a patrol sergeant for about 2 years. And then from that point, I was reassigned back to Criminal Investigations Division, again assigned to drug enforcement, and I was assigned as a supervisor of the drug enforcement unit for about 5 years or so. From there, I was transferred back to plainclothes detectives, where I was assigned as the sergeant supervisor of the youth services unit in the Criminal Investigations Division. I served there for approximately 2 years, and then was promoted to the rank of lieutenant and reassigned as commander of the Criminal Investigations Division.
Thank you, Lieutenant. So fair to say you have a majority or more of your time with the police department has been as a detective in some capacity?
Yes, sir. Doing the math, it's probably 18 or so years, plus or minus.
Thank you. You mentioned that you're currently the lieutenant in charge of the Criminal Investigations Division. Could you please just briefly summarize your responsibilities in that role?
So generally what I do is I oversee all the units that are assigned to the division. I have some sergeants that are assigned to me. The general ebb and flow of work, delegation of responsibilities in various cases. I receive briefings on some of the more major cases, ensure that scheduling, typical managerial things, and again, general overall supervision of the unit. Provide leadership, motivation to the investigators assigned to the unit. Those are my general responsibilities.
Thank you, Lieutenant. Do you have any prior experience investigating homicides, aggravated felonious sexual assaults, robberies, or other major felonies?
I do. Over the course of 18 or so years in investigations, I've had the opportunity to investigate homicides, be part of investigative teams involving homicides, as well as investigating numerous aggravated felonious sexual assaults, stabbings, shootings, robberies, numerous major crimes.
Thank you, Lieutenant. I'd like to now ask you about the investigation into the deaths of Stephen and Wendy Reid in April of 2022 here in the city of Concord. Are you familiar with that investigation?
I am.
And what is your role with regard to that investigation?
My role, again, was the commander of the Criminal Investigations Division. and overseeing the general investigative process and all the investigators that were assigned to the case. This particular instance, and as would take place in other major crimes, because of these homicides, there's still other crimes and still other cases coming into the investigations division. So as the commander of the division, I took on more of a personal role in the actual supervision of this particular case.
So, Lieutenant, there are lead detectives or lead investigators assigned to this investigation, correct?
Yes,
And you supervise them.
I do.
You are familiar with the way the investigation has developed and major developments that have come along over the course of that investigation. Is that right?
I am. We had regular meetings on a daily basis, daily briefings and conversations. I conferred with multiple investigators throughout the entire investigation and took part in some of the activities.
Thank you, Lieutenant. How did the police first become involved with Stephen and just Wendy Reid's case?
On April 20th of 2022, the Concord Police Department had received information of a missing couple from Concord. Initially, it was a patrol response. Patrol officers, along with New Hampshire State Police uniform officers, responded to the area of where the missing persons complaint had originated and began search efforts, interviewing neighbors, family members, getting a general kind of overview of what was exactly going on.
And just generally speaking, Lieutenant, what was the nature of the missing persons report?
So the nature of the missing persons report is that a husband and wife, Stephen and just Wendy Reid, had gone for a hike or what was referred to as a tick-free walk on Monday, April 18th, and that they had not been heard from since. On Wednesday, Stephen had a scheduled tennis match, which he missed. It was highly unusual. Stephen and Wendy had communicated with family members on a regular and frequent basis, and when he did not arrive for his Wednesday tennis match, the family alerted law enforcement that they thought that something was amiss.
Your Honor, may I approach just to get the...
Oh, absolutely,
map?
of course.
I'll try to put this where everyone...
Your Honor, if we could just take a look
Of
first.
course.
Absolutely.
We can go over there if you want.
Yeah, if it's easier for you to see it closer, it makes sense.
Yeah, I can move this wherever everyone...
No, I just think they wanted to see the
We
map.
just didn't know which one you were putting up.
So, Lieutenant, and
You wanna sit on this?
actually, I'll ask Your Honor, is it okay if he has kind of standing permission to approach the map if necessary?
Absolutely.
Thank you. So, Lieutenant, I'll try not to have you get up and down too many times, but using this map, can you point out for the court where did Stephen and just Wendy Reid live?
The Alton Woods complex. The Alton Woods complex is down here. It's highlighted in the red. So that's where they lived.
Thank you. And while you're up there, we'll get to this later, but could you point out the Marsh Loop Trail area and the Broken Ground Trail system?
So the Marsh Loop Trail, what ultimately occurs here is that the apartment complex is here. There is a worn trail which is not marked that comes over, crosses underneath the I-393 overpass and crosses over Portsmouth Street, and just immediately adjacent to the overpass is a parking lot that is marked, and that's where the Marsh Loop Trail begins.
And that parking lot, is that fair to say that's the trailhead?
It's a trailhead. There are two trailheads for Marsh Loop Trail. There is an access road that leads up to some Eversource power stations and ultimately a water tower up in this general vicinity. But the main trailhead is right here, but there is also another trailhead along the access road.
Thank you. And again, while you're up, because I don't want you to be getting up and down, there's a notation there for something called Arthur Kelly's tent site. Do you see that,
I
Lieutenant?
do. It's over here just to the northeast of the Alton Woods apartment complex.
And we'll talk about specifics later, but can you just describe, is that a wooded area? Is it clear? What is it?
So the Alton Woods apartment complex, again, is here. There is a roadway, which is part of the complex, that travels through on the outskirts around the entire complex. There is a trail. Ultimately, there is a field out here that has a playground. There's some growing for the community members to grow crops and tomato plants and things like that. There's some dumpsters set out there. There's also a cell tower site that exists out there, which is fenced in, and then just beyond that is a thickly wooded area that runs basically parallel to I-393 and Old Loudon Road.
And Lieutenant, there's a road marked there with a 9 on it. Is that Loudon Road?
Down here is Loudon Road, yes.
And is Loudon Road just generally a fairly busy street in Concord with a lot of retail on it?
Yes, sir. Loudon Road's exactly what you just said, a fairly busy street with a number of retail businesses, apartment complexes, and things like that.
And I'm also going to ask you to point out, is there a Shaw's supermarket on that map?
There is. A Shaw's supermarket is, the green right here actually is going to signify a cut through, which appears to be power lines. Loudon Road, there is an intersection right here, and almost directly across the street is a Shaw's supermarket located on Diamante, or Diamante and Loudon Road.
Lastly, could you point out where the Walmart is on that map?
So the Walmart is just a bit farther in this direction. Up here, it's signified in blue, and it's labeled Walmart, again, off of Loudon Road.
Thank you. I think you can take your seat now. Lieutenant, you mentioned that the police learned, or the general details of the initial missing persons report were that Stephen and Wendy Reid had been missing since around Monday, April 18th, and Stephen had missed a regularly scheduled tennis match on April 20th. Did police respond and go to the Reid's apartment?
So on the evening of the 20th, again, an initial patrol response with New Hampshire State Police patrol officers as well. Uniform officers responded to the apartment complex, to the apartment, and began efforts to search the immediate area. Again, speaking with family members, getting an initial report to a baseline of what was going on.
Was there any indication from speaking with those family members or a search of their apartment that anything was amiss or had gone wrong?
No, the initial report and the follow-up initial investigation, again, indicated that this was highly unusual, that there was nothing amiss. Their vehicles were still present at the apartment complex. The residence itself, nothing appeared to be in disarray or disorder, and there was no indications that there was any expected travel. There was no bags packed. There was nothing out of the ordinary found that particular during that incident or that event.
Lieutenant, you said that police began searching the area. Does that include the wooded areas surrounding the Alton Woods complex that we can see on the map there?
Yes.
And generally, the police became involved sometime in the evening of Wednesday, April 20th. Is that fair?
Yes, the initial report came into the Concord Police Department sometime around 6 o'clock at night, or within that time frame.
And did the police or anyone locate the Reids the night of Wednesday, April 20th?
No, the Reids were not located that evening, no.
Did law enforcement speak to someone living in the woods near what is marked Arthur Kelly's tent site on that map?
Yes, during the search, that initial search under the cover of darkness that evening, New Hampshire State Police K-9 officer had come across a tent. The tent was occupied by somebody. The trooper did not find the Reids present at that tent, but later, shortly thereafter, conferred with Concord police officers who were also conducting a search, advised them of the tent site, and Concord police officers went back to that tent site to follow up.
And what did they learn when they followed up at the tent site?
When they got to the tent site, they encountered a man inside of the tent. He had unzipped the front of the tent, not completely, but partially enough where officers could shine their flashlights inside the tent. Officers shined their flashlights inside the tent, did not see Reids present. They spoke with the subject. Subject did not have identification. I verbally identified himself as Arthur Kelly. They asked him some questions regarding his business there. He indicated that he had just arrived in town from Massachusetts or from Boston, was and just traveling through. They asked if he had seen the couple. He indicated that he had not and was not aware of any such thing. And he was essentially reluctant to provide further information. And being that we were looking for a missing couple at the time, the missing couple was obviously not present at this particular campsite, they decided to leave.
Did he provide a date of birth in addition to his name?
He did. He provided a name, Arthur Kelly, and a date of birth.
Did officers check that information, the name and date of birth, against dispatch records?
Yes, they did. They contacted dispatch. They asked for the name to be run out of the state of New Hampshire for any local contacts as well as any contacts within in New Hampshire, and they also ran it out of the state of Massachusetts, where he indicated that he had come from. Both the information that they learned was that the name had come back not on file, so meaning that there was no records of an Arthur Kelly with that particular date of birth in either state.
Did the officers make any observations about the area around Arthur Kelly's tent?
Yes, they observed a number of Mountain Dew Code Red soda cans just outside the tent. This was a notable observation for the officers because we have a relatively sizable tent encampment type homeless population here in Concord, and generally we find trash, debris, alcohol, empty alcohol cans around tents when we come across them. In this particular,
Can we approach?
Yeah, absolutely.
Lieutenant, I believe you just testified about the officers who spoke with Arthur Kelly on the night of Wednesday the 20th and how they observed multiple Mountain Dew Code Red soda cans outside his tent. Is that where we were?
That's correct.
And you already mentioned that the Reids were not ultimately located that night of Wednesday, April 20th.
That's correct.
Did efforts to locate them continue the next day, Thursday, April 21st?
Yes, on the morning of the 21st, we held a briefing at the Concord Police Department involving multiple assets and agencies, and we delegated tasks and responsibilities for each group involved, and ultimately search efforts resumed. And out in the field and at the Concord Police Department, members of our computer crimes unit and State Police Major Crime began data acquisition involving cellular technology.
So at some point, did police obtain some data regarding a cell phone belonging to Steve and Reid?
Yes, we had searched the Reid's apartment, done a thorough search on that day. On the following day, on the 21st, it was determined that his cell phone was missing, presumably on his person at the time that he went missing, and legal process, I'm sorry, not legal process, but exigency requests were submitted to various cell carriers as well as Google.
And ultimately, did investigators obtain some location data through those requests to Google?
Yes, sir. As the day wore on, close to nightfall, we received a response back from Google. Google provided coordinates, a latitude and a longitude with a degree of accuracy within 11 meters of where Stephen Reid's phone had been prior to being destructively shut off.
So armed with those coordinates, did police search in that area?
Yes, sir. At about that time, the search elements had already concluded their search around 4 o'clock that afternoon. This was approaching, again, nightfall. There was a small contingency still of investigators at the police headquarters. When we received the coordinates, everybody left the police station and went out to those coordinates. State Police Major Crime agreed to send a couple of canines out there and meet the officers as well.
Ultimately, were the Reids located near those coordinates?
Yes, yes.
And what was found?
Upon reaching the coordinates, a canine showed some attention to a particular area. Upon closer examination, we observed a tuft of hair, which appeared to be of African-American hair. Using flashlights and things like that, I observed a skin tone and of a apparent African-American person, and it was apparent to me that just Wendy Reid was in this pile of brush, sticks, and leaves concealed.
So what happened next?
From that point, it was not readily apparent whether there was just one body or two bodies inside of this pile. The pile consisted of, it was positioned behind a tree in a natural depression within the earth. It appeared from just looking at it that it was almost in line with the contours of the earth because of the natural depression, and we were unsure that there were two bodies inside of there. Initial thoughts were to secure the crime scene, that we had a murder, and unknown if there was a second body inside that pile. So I instructed people to start continuing search in the woods for a potential murder-suicide type scenario.
Was Stephen Reid's body ultimately also discovered in that pile of leaves and sticks and debris?
Yes.
Using the map, could you just point out where on the map that location was that you described the bodies being found?
These are the power lines. This is the parking lot area. These are the power lines that lead up. You can see that there's it's all grown in. The power lines actually at the time were also very grown in, but you could see a worn trail. And right here where there is this triangle area is an entrance into the thickly wooded area of the Marsh Loop Trail. Approximately 200 to 300 yards down is where we ultimately found what was believed to be a crime scene, and the bodies were found approximately 100 feet or so down a slope, again in that natural depression, secreted behind a large tree.
So about 100 feet off the Marsh Loop Trail,
Yes, sir.
down a slope some ways.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Was an autopsy conducted on Steve and Wendy Reid?
Yes, the autopsy was conducted the following day.
Was the cause of death determined?
Cause of death was determined to be multiple gunshot wounds.
What was the manner of death determined?
The manner of death was determined to be homicide.
At that point, Lieutenant, did the missing persons investigation transform into a homicide investigation?
Yes, it did.
So now I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and generally to establish the nature of the investigation as it went forward. With this now becoming a homicide investigation, did investigators take efforts to go back and identify that individual who identified himself as Arthur Kelly?
Yes.
And could you describe that?
Detective Lemoyne, who was one of the original, who was one of the officers that encountered Mr. Kelly the previous night, and another detective went back to that campsite. The campsite had been cleared. Everything had been cleaned up. The tent was gone, and there was nothing that showed that campsite had existed at that particular location, as it did the previous day.
Were there any Mountain Dew Code Red cans left on the ground?
No, there was not. There was no trash, no debris, no Mountain Dew cans.
Did the police consider that unusual?
Yes.
Why?
Typically, in the homeless community, when encampments are abandoned, they leave behind trash, debris, their tents. It's too cumbersome to pack up a tent nice and neat, and that's just been my experience in dealing with homeless encampments in the city.
Based on the observations those officers made of all those Mountain Dew Code Red soda cans, was any further investigation conducted?
Yes, due to the unusual nature of the Mountain Dew cans, those officers went over to Walmart. They did a search with Walmart Loss Prevention, looking for any recent purchases of Mountain Dew Code Red, thinking that it was a relatively unique brand. During the course of that search, they came across a person purchasing Mountain Dew Code Red, and acquired images of that person on the Walmart security video footage.
Were those images significant to the police?
They were significant in that they, at the time, the person in those images was wearing a blue bandana, was wearing a black hat, a black backpack, had darker clothing on, and the body frame and body type generally resembled what Detective Lemoyne had seen inside of that tent when he spoke with Arthur Kelly the previous day.
And just, again, to clarify, those images that the police obtained from Walmart of that gentleman buying Mountain Dew Code Red, what day were those images from?
What date? Those images were from the 20th.
Wednesday, April 20th?
Wednesday, April 20th.
Lieutenant, in conjunction with that, or in addition to that effort, did police also begin seeking out anyone in the public or otherwise who may have been on the trail around that time?
Yes, a press release had been issued soliciting information. There was obviously a large police presence up in that area on that day. So a press release was sent out, and as a result of that press release, we received some calls and identified people that were out on the trails that day.
Did the police speak to a woman named Nan Nutt?
Yes, we did.
Could you just generally summarize what she told the police about her involvement?
Ms. Nutt indicated that, or advised that on April 18th, on the afternoon of April 18th, she had been hiking on the Marsh Loop Trail. She began her hike in the vicinity of that main trailhead on the parking lot, as we described on Portsmouth Street. As she walked up the power lines in the worn trail, she had two dogs with her. She observed a couple coming up behind her, walking at a brisk pace. She noted that one was an African-American female, the other was a white male. They appeared content, nothing out of the ordinary with them. Again, they were walking at a brisk pace. She stood off to the side of the trail with her dogs, gave them way, and they passed her and entered into the the thicker wooded canopy area where I previously described the triangle, where the entrance into the Marshall Trail.
Your Honor, so we're getting into some of the confrontation issues that we had brought to the attention of the court. I actually don't object to this specific language right now. I intend on cross-examining regarding some of Ms. Nutt's statements that are quite helpful. And so as long as our questions are answered in the way that we expect they will be, I see no issue here, but I think that I can reserve my right to confrontation if we are unable to actually conduct a meaningful cross-examination here.
I understand. I think what we're talking about is if for some reason, why don't we defer addressing that at this point unless you want to be heard further, Attorney Spicer?
Hearing an objection, I don't think there's anything for me to address at this point.
I think we're just being put on notice that there could be an objection later.
I understand, Your Honor.
Thank you.
So Lieutenant, you mentioned that Ms. Nutt described, what day was this? Sorry, that's a bad question. Ms. Nutt told the police she'd been out on the Marsh Loop Trail on a particular day, is that right?
Correct.
What day was that?
April 18th.
And you described that she told you that she was on the trail and saw a couple pass her. One was a white man and he was accompanied by an African-American female, is that right?
Correct.
What else did she describe going forward?
As they passed her and entered into the canopy, shortly thereafter, she heard gunfire.
Did you say how many shots she heard?
She said 5.
What did she do next?
She was startled. She believed, she indicated or advised that the gunfire was relatively close to her location. She made a decision that she was going to continue on with her, she questioned whether she was going to continue with her walk. She ultimately made the decision to enter into the wood line.
Did she in fact continue her hike and go into the wooded area?
Yes, she did.
And what did she describe happening at that point?
She continued walking up to the Marsh Loop Trail where we have the the stars in that general area. I don't think that this map is quite to scale, but she, as she approached, she observed a white male who was not looking at her, but was facing her, was looking down towards his left, down off the trail, down that slope that I previously described. She was uncomfortable with this person. She continued walking, and she ended up passing by
Your Honor,
him.
I'm going to go ahead and object at this point. I'm concerned about being able to meaningfully cross-examine him because I've reviewed the transcript from Ms. Nutt's conversation with the police, and this information is just not in line with the transcript, and so I'm concerned that I'm not going to be able to meaningfully cross-examine this officer regarding her statements, which we find to be quite helpful.
I understand. I mean, I think what you're saying is that Ms. Nutt may have said something inconsistent with what Lieutenant McGonagle is.
What I'm saying is that there is a confrontation right that we were willing to sort of pass by with the idea that we were going to be able to have a meaningful cross-examination, meaningful enough to tease out the positive facts for our case. However, if he is getting some basic facts incorrect, then that shows me that we're not going to be able to have a meaningful cross-examination of him.
And he is not accurately representing what she says, so he shouldn't be able to present it.
Right, if he's not accurately presenting what she said, then he shouldn't be allowed to present it in violation of his confrontation rights.
I mean, it seems to me what you're saying is that this may be fodder for cross-examination for Lieutenant McGonagle, that perhaps his summary of what Ms. Nutt told the officers is not accurate.
No, I'm actually saying quite the opposite. It's not for fodder for cross-examination because we're not going to get the information we need if he is unable to give accurate facts. It is no longer a meaningful cross-examination if we cannot get those facts out. This is in violation of Mr. Clegg's confrontation rights. And again, we're not trying to hold this process up. We're not trying to do the entire trial today, but we have concerns when incorrect information is coming in, and we have no remedy for bringing that out. That is not a meaningful cross-examination if this witness is unable to answer those questions.
Your Honor, I think the court has correctly identified the remedy here is if counsel believes Lieutenant McGonagle has testified to something incorrectly, they're certainly free to cross-examine him as to those perceived errors. I have not researched this, I don't have case law at my fingertips, but I believe confrontation is a trial right. And again, things are relaxed at this point. So I think for the reasons we discussed earlier, for purposes of establishing just the general background that we need here for this motion, as well as Lieutenant McGonagle's understanding of the investigation, it's important to ask him these questions. Counsel is free to cross-examine him on anything he says here today.
The state is absolutely incorrect. We absolutely do have a confrontation right at a motion to suppress hearing. Due process applies to this hearing. Therefore, we have a full confrontation right. This is now in violation of his due process rights under both the state and federal constitution.
Let me say, one, I understand the objection. In terms of Lieutenant McGonagle testifying about this information, I'm going to allow it, and there'll be cross-examination of this. If the defense believes that there's another document that more fully explains what the witness said, I'll take it, but the objection's overruled.
Lieutenant, you mentioned.
If I can just have one moment.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Oh, I powered it down.
Lieutenant McGonagle's just dealing with his cell phone.
I apologize. I
No
thought I had it powered off here. All right, I apologize. It's I didn't realize I had to put in a PIN code to power it down. Sorry.
Lieutenant McGonagle, I believe we were at the point where Miss Nan Nutt had described encountering a male on the trail. Did she give a description of that male?
She did provide a description.
What was that description?
The description was a white male, brown hair, medium build, approximately 5'10", wearing tan pants, a dark top, and a black backpack, carrying a plastic grocery-style shopping bag with some items protruding from it. He was described as being clean-shaven.
Detective, was Miss Nutt asked to, or did Miss Nutt sit with a sketch artist from the FBI?
At a later point, she did, yes.
Did that sketch artist produce a sketch based on her description?
Yes, she did.
Lieutenant, I'd like to now transition to the broader investigation. Did the Concord Police do further investigation regarding the individual who was described himself as Arthur Kelly and had Mountain Dew cans around his tent?
Further investigation in that we tried to track down any Arthur Kellys that existed with a similar or combination date of birth, age range, things of that nature.
Did you ultimately, or did police ultimately go to Walmart and begin reviewing surveillance video there?
Yes, we did.
What did they learn from that review?
At that point in time, Arthur Kelly and the Walmart video person buying the code red were not positively linked as one and in the same. We began referring to the Walmart person that had purchased Mountain Dew as Mountain Dew Man, as a nickname within the office, and Arthur Kelly was still the person at the tent site. But in an effort to continue with the investigation, surveillance video started being reviewed at Walmart for all Mountain Dew type purchases. In the process of doing that surveillance review, information was gleaned from the detective doing that that the Mountain Dew man that was observed on the 20th purchasing Code Red Mountain Dew was observed entering Walmart and making purchases for several months.
And what time period did those months span when that person was making purchases at Walmart?
Believe the video went back to December, so back towards December was the time that Mountain Dew man was seen on the cameras making purchases.
Was that December of 2021?
Yes,
And this is the Walmart off of Loudon Road that you can see on the map there.
that's correct.
So detectives obtained this video evidence showing, did it appear to be the same man purchasing things at Walmart every time?
Yes, so the person that I'm referring to it now as Mountain Dew man essentially wore the same exact clothing. We began referring to it as his uniform. It consisted of dark pants, dark top, black backpack, a blue bandana similar to like what we would call, see in the movies as a bandit bandana, and a black hat.
Were detectives able to locate receipts for purchases that that individual was seen making at Walmart on those occasions?
Yes, we gathered all receipts of all the purchases that we could identify.
Was any further investigation done based on information from those receipts?
Well, with those receipts and as well as with the video camera footage, Mountain Dew man had always used self-checkout. He paid in cash or he paid using what appeared to be a debit card or a credit card.
So was any investigation done into those cards that he was seen using?
Yes, in combination with the receipts, it was determined that they were prepaid debit cards, and ultimately a legal process was served on those companies, and we obtained information regarding the purchases made and any information related to those particular prepaid cards.
Any relevant information obtained from those efforts?
We learned that there were several packages that had been, or there was some packages shipped to the post office, general delivery in Concord, and we also learned that there was one particular purchase from bulksupplements.com that had been delivered to the Walgreens FedEx drop-off on Loudon Road.
So you mentioned a transaction with something called bulksupplements.com. Was that transaction made using a prepaid debit card?
Yes.
Was that one of the prepaid debit cards that Mountain Dew man was seen using at Walmart?
Yes.
Did you receive any information from bulksupplements.com that corresponded with the transaction?
Yes, bulksupplements.com provided information that the person who had made that purchase identified himself as Logan Clegg.
Was that the first time the police heard the name Logan Clegg?
Yes, it is.
Did police obtain images of Logan Clegg?
Yes.
Were those images compared to the sketch the FBI artist had done?
Yes.
And did you personally?
I personally observed the images. The initial was a Google search just with the name. As soon as the name Logan Clegg came in, we observed some media coverage from out west depicting the defendant's image. We then obtained booking photos from agencies out west, which included side profiles. As we know, the sketch was widely publicized as a side profile. The side profile, when I looked at it side by side, it was eerily similar.
So I'm going to ask you some more questions in a little bit about background investigation on Logan Clegg. But before we get there, during the course of this investigation, did police also discover another tent site in the area of the Marsh Loop Trail system?
Yes, we did.
Okay. And is that, can you see something marked burnt tent site on that trail?
I do.
On that map? Sorry.
Yes.
And is that kind of northwesterly of the recovery location notation?
I don't know if that is going to be true north, but yes, it is. On that map, it is kind of to the north.
Up and to the left?
Yes, up and to the left.
Can you describe how police came to learn about that burnt tent site and generally what you learned?
That burnt tent site was originally discovered by another detective, I believe on the 26th. At that time, it consisted of a number of burnt small propane tanks, not the kind that you would hook up to your grill, but more of camping propane tanks. There were dozens and dozens of them organized in the shape of what appeared to be a square. At that time, on April 26, it was initially believed that perhaps that was old, not relevant to the investigation. As the investigation progressed and more witnesses or tips and information had come in, we learned from another witness that witness had been hiking on either I think the 20th, and had come across those same propane tanks, had snapped a photograph of those propane tanks. We also learned from our internal database at the Concord Police Department that we had received some information, a complaint on April 15th from a complainant, a frequent user of the trails out there, that there was a active tent site at that location, which is now referred to as the burnt tent site. Officer Brian Craig went out to that particular location on April 15th, found a intact tent with a padlock on the tent from the outside, and that there was nobody present at that tent. So that led me to believe that the tent was active and intact on the 15th, and based on the photograph, it had been burned and destroyed by the 20th.
Thank you. I'm going to go back a little bit. You mentioned earlier, Lieutenant, a crime scene was established on the Marsh Loop Trail about 100 feet up the slope from where the bodies of Stephen and Wendy Reid were recovered. Is that right?
Well, the crime scene had been established in a perimeter around that location.
So I'm talking about at that location on the Marsh Loop Trail. Did police obtain any evidence from that location on the trail?
Yes, eventually, approximately a month later, during another visit to the site, 2 shell casings were recovered up on the trail, just 100 feet up from where the bodies were discovered, approximately 100 feet.
Thank you, Lieutenant. And I don't want to go into specifics here, but what is a shell casing? Is that a part of a bullet?
Shell casing, there were Sig Luger 9mm shell casings. Shell casing is the container, if you will, the vessel which holds the round that gets expended out of the firearm. Shell casing gets ejected from a handgun after the round itself has been expelled from the chamber.
So investigators found 2 shell casings marked Sig Luger 9mm on the Marsh Loop Trail. Is that right?
Correct.
And that was about when?
About a month later.
A month after?
About a month after we had finished, after we had recovered the bodies.
Would May 20th sound about right?
Yes.
Returning to the burnt tent site, did investigators ultimately search and process that site as a crime scene as well?
Repeat that.
Did the Concord Police ultimately search the burnt tent site as well?
Ultimately, yes, we did.
Did you recover propane tanks?
Yes, we did.
Say how many?
Over 100. I don't have the exact number.
Did you recover shell casings?
Yes.
Approximately how many?
Again, I do not have a number, but it was a fair amount of shell casings were discovered at that burnt tent site.
Did those shell casings from the burnt tent site have markings on them?
They did.
What markings?
The markings were Sig Luger 9mm.
Is that the same marking as the casings found from the trail?
Yes, they're the same markings from the site of where we believe the murders occurred.
Lieutenant, were the shell casings from the trail sent to the State Police Forensic Lab here in New Hampshire?
They were.
And were the shell casings from the burnt tent site also sent to the State Police Forensic Laboratory?
They were.
And this, again, this is in the months leading up to October. Were those shell casings forensically analyzed at the state lab?
Yes, they were forensically analyzed, and ballistics indicated that the shell casings found at both the burnt tent site and at the murder site were fired from the same weapon.
And at that point, it was unknown what weapon that was.
It was unknown what weapon that was, other than it being a 9mm.
Okay. Was any evidence obtained from the autopsy regarding ballistic fragments?
There was ballistics and bullet fragments found within this Wendy Reid's head. Those bullets were completely destroyed. So yes, there was evidence found within the bodies of this Wendy Reid.
Lieutenant, I'd like to return back to the police discovering the name Logan Clegg in connection with that bulksupplements.com transaction. Did police continue to investigate Logan Clegg once you obtained that name?
Yes, once we obtained the name, we began doing a thorough background check on Logan Clegg's history.
Did you learn whether he had any prior involvement with law enforcement anywhere in the country?
Yes, we had learned that he was currently on probation. He had absconded from probation out of Utah, that he had a active warrant, which for that probation, from absconding from probation. The underlying charges were firearms and weapons charges. He had been convicted of burglary. He had been involved in a investigation for a prior homicide where he had stabbed somebody in 2018 in Spokane, Washington, had stabbed somebody to death on his way to work, where he was working at a McDonald's.
Your Honor, there's a mischaracterization here. He was never charged with any sort of homicide.
I don't think that the lieutenant has testified that he was charged with homicide, only that he was investigated.
I think that was testimony that he was investigated for a prior homicide involving a stabbing in the state of Washington.
Okay, we'll deal with it on cross.
I understand. I understand.
Was Logan Clegg ever charged with homicide?
No, sir, he was never charged. It was determined that he had a self-defense claim. Prosecution never went forward with any types of charges.
Did police also learn that Mr. Clegg had purchased something from an online company called Brownells?
Yes, during from the prepaid debit cards, transaction history indicated that there was an online purchase from Brownells. Brownells is an online firearms and accessory type store.
Approximately when did police learn that?
After his identification, when we actually got the legal process of what was actually purchased was not until fairly late in the investigation. I don't have a specific date of when we served Brownells with the legal process originally.
Okay. Do you also learn about whether or not Mr. Clegg had ever worked in the area of Concord, New Hampshire?
Yes, we canvassed up and down Loudon Road and some of the various locations. After we had received the name Logan Clegg, my detectives went to McDonald's on Loudon Road, determined that he had been a former employee there.
Did the police obtain his application materials to that job at McDonald's?
Yes, we received a handwritten application to McDonald's on Loudon Road.
Did that application have an email address listed?
It did. It had an email address of RKX Kelly on the application.
Is that a Gmail address?
It was a Gmail address.
Did police obtain any further information related to rkxkelly@gmail.com?
Legal process was served to Google, and subscriber info indicated that the name on the account was Arthur Kelly.
And this was, again, prior to October 11th, 2022?
Correct.
Did police also learn anything about Mr. Clegg's travel history?
Again, during the course of his background, we had learned that he had traveled to Europe on at least 2 prior occasions, and spent a significant amount of time out in Europe, eventually landing in Boston on November 7th on his return.
Would that be November 7th of 2021?
Correct.
Did police learn anything about whether or not Mr. Clegg had planned a trip but missed it?
Yes, in February of 2022, while we believed that Logan Clegg was living in the woods out there on the broken ground trails, we had received information that he had booked a flight to Iceland out of Newark, and that the flight manifest indicated that he was not on that flight.
And I apologize for jumping around here, Lieutenant, but I'm going to go back to Walmart and Walmart video surveillance. Did the police obtain any video surveillance during this investigation from Tuesday, April 19th?
Tuesday, April 19th, the day after the homicides, we observed Mr. Clegg purchasing a tent and a sleeping bag and a bottle of rubbing alcohol from Walmart in the morning hours, less than 24 hours after the homicides.
Thank you. Lieutenant, on October 3rd of 2022, did the Concord Police receive some information about a bus trip to Burlington, Vermont?
We did. We had served legal process to Greyhound, looking for information regarding travel of any Logan Clegg's or Arthur Kelly's, under the understanding that you're not required to provide a identification or any type type of real information. But we did do that, and we received information that Ann Arthur Kelly, with no date of birth, had traveled from South Station to Albany, New York, and then ultimately to Burlington, Vermont.
What date was that trip?
That was back in May. I don't know the specific date. It was maybe the second week of May.
Would May 15th, 2022 sound?
That's accurate.
So that was on October 3rd of 2022?
When we received the results from Greyhound, yes.
That related to this mid-May bus trip by someone who listed the name Arthur Kelly, is that right?
Correct.
What, if any, follow-up investigation did the police do after receiving that information?
We contacted South Station to see if they had any video records from the date of the departure. They indicated they did not. We contacted the bus station in Burlington, Vermont, where the destination was, to see if they had any video records of the day of arrival. They did not. We contacted McDonald's, Walmart, and locations that we knew that, based on Mr. Clegg's pattern of life, where he may have took up work. We knew that he had previously worked at McDonald's. We knew that he previously worked at Walmart's. So we checked those locations to determine if an Arthur Kelly or a Logan Clegg worked at either of those locations. Nobody had heard the names. We contacted law enforcement agencies in Burlington, asked them to check their systems. They had no contact with Logan Clegg or an Arthur Kelly, and we ultimately had flyers with his picture sent out to all law enforcement agencies in Vermont to be on the lookout for Logan Clegg with an AKA Arthur Kelly.
Lieutenant, that information that the police received from Greyhound, it contained the name Arthur Kelly, is that right?
Correct.
Did it contain a phone number?
It contained no other identifying information, no date of birth, and no phone number,
No email?
no email.
One moment, please.
Absolutely.
How about October 11th of 2022? On that date, did something of note occur with regard to this investigation?
Yes, Detective Gorham had received a telephone call from a detective out in Utah, detective that essentially held the warrant for Mr. Clegg for the parole or probation violation. He indicated that he had received a notification from Homeland Security that Mr. Clegg had booked a flight to Berlin out of JFK Airport, New York City, to depart on the 14th in the early morning hours at approximately 12:30 a.m.
Is that Berlin, Germany?
Yes.
Not New Hampshire. How did Detective Gorham receive this information?
She received it via telephone call
And so about what time of the day did she receive that?
around noontime.
When she received that phone call, what did the Concord Police do?
When she received that phone call, it was certainly a moment that, okay, we know he's leaving the country in short order. Detective Gorham began reaching out to Homeland Security, Customs and Border Protection, trying to get some more concrete, solid information, booking information, flight information, knowing that booking information is likely going to contain some information related to the actual booking of the flight that we might be able to track.
So just to be specific here, in that initial phone call, what information did Detective Gorham receive?
It was very limited that Mr. Clegg had booked a flight to Berlin, Germany, leaving or departing JFK on the 14th at 12:30 a.m. There was no other information that was provided to her.
Did Detective Gorham subsequently receive more detailed information?
Yes, throughout the day, she was in communication with, like I said, Homeland Security, Customs and Border Protection, trying to get a hold of their records to show the booking information.
And how did she receive more detailed information?
Eventually, she received an email that had been forwarded from Customs and Border to Homeland Security and eventually to her.
Your Honor, at this time, I know this is on case lines and I'm still.
Oh, I know.
What we're looking to move into evidence is Exhibit 1. purposes of this hearing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Doesn't sound like he's on. Can you try again?
There we go. All right, so we received video footage showing on October 18th, the same person, Mountain Dew Man, October 18th being the day of the homicides, walking out of Shaw's Supermarket. That person was carrying a grocery bag with some items protruding from it. The security footage throughout the parking lot showed that person moving. Can I get up and point?
Yes.
Showed the person, Mountain Dew Man, moving across the parking lot, getting to Loudon Road, and eventually crossing over and then going off out of sight, presumably up into the power lines.
So, Lieutenant, this was from April 18th,
This is from April 18th, the day of the homicides.
and about what time of day?
In the afternoon, Detective Brown or somebody would probably be able to give you an exact, precise timeline, but it was in the afternoon, around the same time that the victims were leaving their apartment.
Thank you. Thank you, Lieutenant. So I'd like to jump back to October 11th. You had previously testified that Detective Gorham got a phone call with some information that Logan Clegg had booked a flight, and that, I think before we broke, we put into evidence an exhibit. Are you looking at that exhibit?
I am.
You're driving, so you scroll down to.
I can actually drive it as well.
Okay. So, is this the email that Detective Gorham received that afternoon?
It is.
And what time did she receive it from that individual at the Homeland Security Department?
She received it at 4:38 p.m.
Did she receive it at 4:38? Are you sure? Or it's not 4:41?
I apologize. It was sent to Customs Border Protection and then forwarded on to Homeland Security and then ultimately received by Detective Gorham October 11th at 4:41.
So, did Detective Gorham share this email with you and other detectives when she received it?
She did.
And does that email contain more information related to the flight that Logan Clegg had booked?
Yes, it does.
And with regard to that flight, did it contain an address?
Did it contain an address of 11 Elmwood Ave in Burlington, Vermont?
Did it also contain a phone number?
It did contain a phone number, yes.
What was the phone number?
Let me find it on here. The phone number presented on the booking information was 802-598-8657.
And lastly, Detective, this was all booking information related to that flight, as you understood it, correct?
Relating to the flight out of JFK to Berlin.
And what was the name of the person who booked the flight?
The name of the person who booked the flight was Logan Clegg.
So, Lieutenant, once you received that information, which was booking information that Logan Clegg had booked a particular flight and given a particular address and phone number, what did you do?
The first thing I did is I wanted to verify the phone number, that it was an active working phone number, and that it wasn't just a bunch of made-up digits.
Did you take steps to do that?
We did. We used a open source or a subscription-based provider that we have called TLO. We ran the phone number through TLO. TLO indicated that the phone number came back from as a low percentage to a person out of Vermont. Low percentage indicates to me that the phone number is a legitimate phone number. It's not just a bunch of made-up digits, and that it had been used at one point in time by this particular person.
And why were you concerned that it might be just a string of random digits and not a real phone number?
Knowing Logan Clegg's history and his desire and ability to fly under the radar, I was at that point a little bit concerned that he had just used random digits.
So at some point, did you do anything else with regard to that information and potential next steps?
Well, in looking at the flight, the booking information, I also noticed that there was a Proton email address. I know Proton email is a email that is used by people that the Proton email does not cooperate with law enforcement. It's an out of the country is where they hold their servers. It's frequently advertised on the internet for secrecy. The address itself, we checked 11 Elmwood Ave. It was a federal building in Burlington, Vermont, and it also housed the Burlington Post Office. And of course, with the area code and overall looking at the booking and flight information, knowing that it was a legitimate phone number, I came to the belief that the information provided in this book and flight was all accurate.
And so, I'd like to ask you a little bit more about that. Did you or any of your detectives do any research into the area of Burlington, Vermont itself?
We did once we had this, and that in conjunction with our bus ticket, or the bus ticket of Arthur Kelly from prior, the two started making sense. We brought up Burlington, Vermont on a map and started looking around various areas in Burlington that were consistent with what we knew to be Logan Clegg's pattern of life. And we observed a main thoroughfare in Burlington. I believe it was Walston or Williston Road. There was a number of stores, fast food places and things like that. There was a highway, and just on the other side of that was a patch of woods, which was nearly a carbon copy of the Broken Ground Trail System. And looking at that, and prior to having any actual location, real-time location data, it was very likely to us that if he was in fact in Burlington, Vermont, that this would be a very attractive location for him to be, based on things that we knew from Concord, New Hampshire, and from when he was on probation, and what he had provided as probation officer of where he was living out west.
So, Lieutenant, after conducting all of this information based on the information in that email, what did you ultimately decide?
I decided that, I knew at that point in time that the weapon had not been recovered. I believed that Logan Clegg was an immediate threat to the public. We knew that we had a deadline of him leaving the country. I knew that if he left the country, the odds of capturing him were very unlikely, and that we were on the clock and we had a brief window of time to apprehend him. The phone number itself was a viable source to actually track him. It was an actionable piece of information that we had. So I spoke to Detective Carter, and I told him to research the phone, identify the phone carrier, and ultimately it was Verizon, contact Verizon and request agency pings to see, get the phone, if it was active, if it was pinging, and where it was.
Could you just briefly describe what is an exigency ping, and what does it tell you?
An exigency ping tells us, A, that the phone is on, that it's connected to a cell tower, and it will give us a radius of where, from the phone to the tower, a distance, which is vague. So it may say 1,100 meters in one 15-minute increment, and then 15 minutes later it may say 800 meters or 700 meters, but it'll tell you that it's within a certain radius of a cell tower.
And to be clear, it gives you coordinates, correct, with longitude and latitude?
It does give you coordinates, but again, within a radius, which the radius itself is fairly inaccurate.
So those coordinates come with a range of accuracy, is that fair to say?
Correct.
So these coordinates, but it may only be within a certain amount of meters, whether...
Could say within 1,500 meters, the next one could say within 800 meters. Exactly.
So, Lieutenant, you mentioned that you've been a detective for approximately 18 years, is that correct?
Correct.
Have you had occasion to check that? You mentioned that you felt Logan Clegg was a threat.
Yes.
Why?
We hadn't found the murder weapon, so it was presumed that the murder weapon was still in his possession. We knew that the heinous act of what happened, the seemingly randomness of the act, told me that the public in general was at risk at any moment. This was not a drug deal gone bad. This was no apparent robbery gone bad where they were killed for a particular reason, however minor that may have been. The incident was not essentially over. The randomness of it certainly elevated to me. The fact that Mr. Clegg had killed, although not charged in the past, certainly gave me the thought that he was a danger to the community and to society in general. Again, with the weapon being out there. And that being said, there was a certain concern for loss and destruction of evidence. He had a history of destroying evidence. We know that he had burnt the tent site. We know that he has a history of flight. He had absconded from probation. We knew that he had a flight from Burlington, Vermont, or from outside of the country anyhow to go into Berlin, a one-way flight. We knew that he fled immediately after the homicides on that occurred on April 18th. So there were a lot of factors that were very concerning to me regarding a date of the 14th at 12:30 in the morning, which would have to put Logan Clegg into New York City and at the airport sometime 2 or 3 hours prior to that flight, so likely on the evening of the 13th, and we are now into the evening hours of the 11th.
Lieutenant, why couldn't the police have just waited for Mr. Clegg at the airport in New York?
Certainly, if that was a backup plan, if all else failed, a fail-safe would have been to be at the airport and apprehend him on the Utah warrants. But it was common sense to me to know that all the evidence and perhaps and potentially and likely the murder weapon would have been missing. He wouldn't have brought the murder weapon to the airport with him, and that was a major concern of mine.
Were you confident that he would arrive at the airport?
I was not 100% confident that he would have arrived at the airport. We know that he had booked a flight in February and that he did not show up, so there was absolutely no guarantee that he would show up, although it was certainly a contingency plan.
Lieutenant, you mentioned that you asked Detective Carter to submit a request to Verizon for those pings.
Yes.
Correct? Was that through the exigent circumstances hotline or exigency emergency protocol for Verizon?
Yes, it was.
And you're familiar with that process, is that correct?
I am.
And have you used that process before during your many years as a detective?
I have used that process before, yes.
Have you also submitted search warrants for cell phone location data during
Yeah.
your career?
Yes.
Could you say how many?
I could say as an affiant, many. As a supervisor of investigations, our unit in general is hundreds that I've been a part of, yes.
So, on October 11th, at the point that you asked Detective Carter to make that request to Verizon, did you believe exigent circumstances existed to request that information?
I believe the exigent circumstances in the essentially the Webster's dictionary, version of exigency existed as soon as we found the bodies. But as soon as we found this phone number and we had actionable information, I believe that exigent circumstances existed at that moment that we needed to start tracking that phone number and locate Mr. Clegg.
I want to ask you about what you just said, Lieutenant. When did you first believe it was imperative to locate the person who had killed Stephen and Wendy Reid?
As soon as we found the bodies, it was imperative that we locate this person as soon as possible.
So did anything that you learned on October 11th about Logan Clegg's travel plans create the belief in your mind that it was important?
Objection, we're leading, he's already answered the question about when he thought it was exigent.
Well, I haven't finished the question. This is a different topic, and I think a leading question suggests the answer. This does not.
When I have you finish the question, then I'll hear if there's an objection.
Your Honor, the question is hinting at what he wants him to say at next. Once the question is out, then the objection becomes moot.
Why don't counsel approach and I'll hear the question first.
So Lieutenant, we were talking about your experience with exigent circumstances and contacting companies like Verizon or other cell phone carriers. You had experience doing that?
Yes.
Typically, how does that work?
Typically contacting for exigency, it's to 24/7, as we previously described hotline. We
Your
call
Honor,
it.
I apologize. Can we approach on this?
Yeah, absolutely.
So Lieutenant, typically how does a police officer make a request to Verizon or AT&T or a cell phone company like that for information under exigent circumstances?
We call the exigent circumstances hotline, provide the information that we have, explain why we believe it to be exigent. If it apparently meets their criteria, they provide the information requested.
And so is that typically done by phone?
That is done by phone.
And is there, do you ever have to follow up with anything in writing?
We follow up with a form, and yes, we follow up with a form with an official written request.
What kind of information can you request based on exigent circumstances from a company like Verizon?
Real-time data regarding whether the cell phone is active, subscriber information on the phone, call detail, text or SMS detail. Those are essentially the items that we receive.
You don't get content of text messages, do you?
No.
And you mentioned real-time data. That's those exigency pings you mentioned before.
Correct.
How do those get received, or how are those provided?
The first ping was given verbally, and then from there on after we request like every 50 minutes or a time frame, and it's received via email.
Is that what happened on October 11th with regard to this investigation?
Yes.
Lieutenant, I'd like to now ask you about search warrants. Generally, in order to obtain information from a company like Verizon by a search warrant, what is the process to do that?
the typical search warrant process, typing the search warrant, going it through the court's portal, having the search warrant approved, signed, sent back to us, and then it is faxed to the general legal compliance fax number for Verizon.
So I'd like to focus on the first portion of that. In order for there to be a search warrant, the police have to provide an affidavit in support of the application, correct?
That is correct.
And that affidavit has to contain the reasons that you're requesting this information.
Yes,
And that affidavit is then put before a judge, fair to say, right?
that's accurate.
How is that submitted to the judge?
It's submitted to judge via a portal. It's a general court's search warrant portal. It's uploaded, and the phone call is now made during after hours to their 1-800 number, and they notify the on-call judge that this is after hours and that it is, there's got to be a reason for it. We're holding a house, we have some sort of concerns, something that cannot wait for the morning. The after-hours judge reviews a warrant, and then it's uploaded back and sent to us.
And so typically, what is the turnaround on an after-hours warrant from the time it's submitted to the judge and to the time it typically is received?
Well, I would say that would vary. Within a couple of hours.
Okay, so it can
In my experience with it, if we're holding a house or a general after hours warrant, it would be within a couple of hours by the time we receive it back.
So it can be that quick.
Yes,
But that is just to get the warrant approved by the judge, is that right?
correct.
Once the warrant is approved, and say you want to serve a warrant for cell phone location data on Verizon, what happens next?
It being after hours, we would, even during business hours, we would fax that warrant to their search warrant phone number to Verizon.
Provided by a fax?
That's the protocol. We send it via fax.
And that's typically how Concord Police knows to, or that's Concord Police's practice?
That's our practice. That's how we've been trained. With the law enforcement response team with Verizon is subpoenas and legal compliance is to be faxed to a particular phone number.
And do you have any personal knowledge of what happens to that search warrant once it goes to Verizon?
Like, I obviously can't speak to what they do at Verizon and how that is processed.
But at some point, Verizon does process it, correct? And give the police a response?
Yes.
And that response would either be search warrant granted, here's the information requested, or we're not going to provide it for some reason?
A search warrant granted by a judge, they may follow up with questions about specific data that you're looking for. They may say that we don't have this or we don't have that. But on a general circumstance, we would send what we're requesting. They'll provide us what we're requesting at some point in time.
Do you get a tracking number or an estimated time that it would take to respond to your submission?
We do not get a tracking number that I am aware of. We don't get an estimated time. I know in the law enforcement response manual from Verizon, they have goals. Their goals are to serve those search warrants within 14 days.
So just with regard to your own experience, though, have you submitted search warrants to Verizon before?
Yes,
And have you supervised other officers who've done the same?
absolutely.
As part of that process, is there a standard message that's received where Verizon says, here's how long it will take us to process your submission?
I'm not familiar with ever receiving a message saying it's going to take X, Y, and Z time.
So when you submit that search warrant, you don't know how long it's going to be?
No, you fire it off and you sit and wait.
Do you have experience submitting search warrants for cell phone location, or search warrants that include a request for cell phone location data to Verizon and other companies like that?
Historical data.
Historical data. Typically, how long does it take, in your experience, to receive results back?
2 to 3 weeks is a general response time.
Have you ever received results back the same day you submitted a search warrant to Verizon?
Negative, no.
Have you ever received results back within 3 days from submitting a search warrant to Verizon?
No.
So, Lieutenant, on October 11th, at the point that you asked Detective Carter to make that exigency request to Verizon for real-time cell phone location data, why didn't you do that via search warrant?
Because of my experience, I knew we were not going to get that information prior to the defendant's departure. Therefore, it was going to hinder our ability to apprehend him. We had a weapon out there that we needed to seize, which we believed to be the murder weapon. And I believed at that moment and the moment of their deaths that he was a significant threat to society and to anybody that he came into contact with. I had reviewed the AG's manual that particular evening to make sure that I was following procedure and protocol. And to me, this incident was a definition of exigency.
Thank you, Lieutenant.
Do we want to see the
So-
AG
Yeah.
manual?
We would just request that during the recess, we'd be provided with a copy of the AG's manual. We haven't, to my knowledge, been provided in the
That he
discovery.
received?
So there's an agreement to provide that manual to the defense?
It's a public document, yeah. And we'll provide one.
Absolutely, thank you.
So Lieutenant, Detective Carter made that request. Do you remember about what time he did that in the afternoon of October 11th? Or the evening?
It would have been after this. It would have been after this email. So I'm trying to move this thing. It would have been after 4:41. If I was going to estimate, it would have probably been within 30 minutes. I did not. I did some review. I did some thought. I conferred with others, and I made the decision that this needed to be done. And we needed to start getting assets and resources up to Burlington, Vermont, and we needed to start searching for him.
So Lieutenant, it was your decision to request that data via exigent circumstances.
It was my decision.
After making that request, did Verizon start providing real-time pings or location data?
Yes, they did.
What did those show?
Those showed that the phone was actively, it was turned on, and it was actively pinging in Burlington, Vermont.
Could you tell where in Burlington, Vermont that phone was pinging?
The radius was generally in the area of the Centennial Woods, which I had previously described as the carbon copy of the Broken Ground Trail System. It was sporadic. There was one ping that came back out on the highway. There was concern at that moment in time. He had already gotten onto a bus, perhaps, headed to New York. But then the very next ping was back in the area of that general radius, Centennial Woods, the main thoroughfare. The radius was very large at that point in time.
Lieutenant, did you identify the Centennial Woods before receiving the ping data?
Yes,
So once that ping data started coming in, how frequently did it come in?
every 15 minutes.
I think you mentioned the first one was provided over the phone.
Yes,
Subsequent information was provided by email.
yes.
Once this data started coming in, what did you do?
Once the data started coming in, I thought about using a cell site simulator to get a solid pinpoint location as to where that phone was actually located. I conferred with William Tufts, the United States Marshal Service, about using the cell site simulator that they had, and we discussed it. He advised that they were going to need a search warrant to deploy the cell site simulator, at which time I had another detective start working on a search warrant for the use of the cell site simulator.
Could you just briefly, for the court, describe what is a cell site simulator?
In general, a cell site simulator is a device that mimics a cell tower, and when phone numbers are essentially programmed into it and it gets close or within range, that phone number starts then pinging off of that simulator, and that simulator or that device can now hone down and track down to the specific location where that phone is originating from.
Based on your knowledge of this type of equipment, would a cell site simulator provide more accurate or specific location data than the type of ping data you were receiving from Verizon?
Once it started collecting the pings, once it got within range, it would bring you right down to the exact location of where that person is or where that phone is.
And so, Detective, do you know whether or not, excuse me, Lieutenant, do you know whether or not New Hampshire law requires a search warrant before using a cell site simulator?
Yes, we do.
And you in fact had a detective begin working on an application for a search warrant for that purpose, is that right?
That's correct.
About when did you do that?
Cell site simulator search warrant started probably around 6:30 or so that evening. And that's the evening of the 11th.
Does the Concord Police, do the Concord Police have cell site simulator equipment?
No.
So where is the cell site simulator equipment you were intending to use?
It's in the possession of the United States Marshal Service, and they house it down in Boston.
So did the police eventually submit a search warrant application to use that cell site simulator?
Yes.
And was that approved by a judge?
Yes, it was.
About when did you receive that approval?
We received the approval from the judge just before midnight that evening.
So did the Concord Police end up ever actually using the cell site simulator equipment as authorized by the warrant?
No, we did not.
Why not?
We already had assets up in Burlington, Vermont that were conducting surveillance on Centennial Woods, getting a lay of the land of the bus station, anticipating that Mr. Clegg was going to be, we anticipated that he would be taking a bus out of Burlington, Vermont to New York City. And our thought process was if he was living in Centennial Woods, that we would get eyes on the common entrances and exits. And they got a hotel room in the early morning hours, got a few hours of sleep, and they were instructed to be out conducting surveillance on those wooded areas at sunrise.
Lieutenant, why didn't you have, well, strike that. When did you send detectives to Burlington physically?
Again, probably right around about 7 o'clock or so on the evening of the 11th is when I started sending an undercover element up there to start doing surveying the sites and surveillance for us.
Why didn't you have, strike that. Lieutenant, if you were receiving pings every 15 minutes and those pings continued throughout the night, why didn't you have your people in Burlington go attempt to actually locate Logan Clegg that night?
Well, we believed that he was staying likely in a tent in the Centennial Woods in that wooded area, and due to his dangerousness, knowing that he was likely armed, and the whole totality of the circumstances, I was not in a position where I could, where I was comfortable placing officers into a wooded area at nightfall looking for an armed subject with an unknown location, with the limited resources that we had available at that moment.
At some point on the evening of October 11th, did you or any of your officers contact local authorities in Burlington?
Yes, we were speaking with local authorities in Burlington throughout the evening
Why did you do that?
to advise them of what we had going on. It's courtesy. We're going to be entering another jurisdiction, entering another state, and to advise them that this was that he was up there and that he was wanted on the fugitive, and for their own safety, if they came across him, unbeknownst to them, that he is a suspect in a double homicide, and there's a lot of danger involved in that. We certainly were going to need any resources that they had available to deploy to us. So yes, we were in communication with them throughout the evening.
Lieutenant, you've mentioned a number of steps that you took after receiving that booking information from the federal authorities. Could you describe the atmosphere at the police station that day?
We were busy, to say the least. There was a lot of information coming in throughout the afternoon, and there was a lot of thought processes going through with potentially sending investigators down to New York City, communicating with the Burlington authorities, getting updated information, communicating with the United States Marshal Service regarding the cell site simulator and logistically how that could be deployed. And It was a generally chaotic atmosphere that was, everybody was very, very busy, and there were a lot of moving parts.
Lieutenant, you mentioned that first request by Detective Carter to Verizon. Did he make any other exigency requests?
Yes, he made 2 more.
When was the second request?
The second one was approximately an hour later.
What was that second request for?
That second one was for SMS detail or text messages. So not content, but essentially whether that phone had sent or received text messages and the numbers.
So did that second request ask for any location data that you hadn't already requested?
No.
And when was the third request made?
Following day.
What was that request for?
That request was for RTT data. RTT is round to terminal. It's basically a time that the phone sends the ping to the time that it hits the tower and the time that it comes back. And cell phone experts, forensic experts in that field can use that information to help pinpoint or narrow down a location.
So is that a form of location data?
It's a form of data that allows you to get a location. And forgive my ignorance on that, but that's not my expertise, but that is my understanding from being briefed on RTT data.
So that third request, when was that made?
The following morning.
Do you remember about when?
Early morning. I don't have the exact time. Early morning.
So this would be the morning of October 12th, is that correct?
Yes.
Ultimately, was Logan Clegg located in Burlington on the morning of October 12th?
He was.
About what time?
9:30 or so.
How was he located?
The SMS information that we had received via that second exigency request provided a phone number. That phone number was then researched with lots of our federal partners as well, but ultimately a TLO search provided a name, background into that name, gave an employment of Price Choppers in Burlington, Vermont. Once we had a phone number and a name and the location Price Choppers, we deployed our undercover element over to Price Choppers. They entered Price Choppers and they observed Logan Clegg collecting his last paycheck and saying goodbye.
Was Logan Clegg ultimately arrested later that afternoon?
Yes, he was.
And was he arrested on that probation violation warrant?
Yes, he was.
So he was not arrested on any warrant out of New Hampshire?
That is correct.
And Lieutenant, after Logan Clegg was arrested on that probation violation warrant, did officers go and speak with him? From
Yes.
Concord Police? Yeah.
Yes,
Did you personally speak with him?
I did not.
So did you have any involvement with those interviews?
No, I did not.
And did the investigation, so to speak, continue after he was arrested and spoke with officers?
Yes, of course.
Did police ultimately locate well, when he was arrested, did he have a backpack with him?
He did.
Did police ultimately obtain a search warrant to search that backpack?
Yes, we ultimately obtained a search warrant to search that backpack.
What was found in the backpack?
And found inside of that backpack was a Glock 9mm handgun containing a fully loaded with Sig Luger 9mm rounds. That was what was found in the backpack.
Was that handgun sent to the New Hampshire State Lab for testing?
Yes, we sent additional officers up to Vermont at that very moment. They collected that firearm. They brought it down to New Hampshire. It was delivered first before the lab even opened the following morning for analysis and ballistics.
What were the results of the analysis?
That that firearm fired the shell casings that were recovered at both the murder site and at the burnt tent site.
And did detectives ultimately locate a campsite somewhere in Burlington that was associated with Logan Clegg?
Yes, we did, or yes, they did.
And was that campsite searched as well, pursuant to a warrant?
Pursuant to a warrant, yes, that campsite was searched.
Just a few more questions, Your Honor.
Absolutely.
Lieutenant, I'd like to go back to the point where you ordered Detective Carter to make that request to Verizon. So at that point, you had determined that exigent circumstances justified making that request without a warrant, is that right?
That's correct.
If, for some reason, Verizon had not provided you with that location data that they did, whether because they refused or there were technical difficulties or whatever it may be, would you have ultimately requested a search warrant for location data associated with that phone number as part of the investigation?
We absolutely would have requested a search warrant, not just for location data, for subscriber info, historical data, all phone usage. The phone would have been a key element in the investigation.
Why is that?
Because phones contain lots of information. They contain people's historical data, where they came from. We certainly wanted to know where Logan Clegg had come from. And we're looking at this if we had gathered this information at a later date. We certainly would have wanted to know where he had come from, where he was at the time, and or where he was planning on going. And that telephone certainly could have provided us with that information.
And what made you confident that that phone was connected to Logan Clegg?
Looking at this flight booking information, everything on this flight booking information is apparently accurate, so I have no reason to believe that if all this other information is accurate, that that particular phone number is not as accurate as well. So if I believe that all of this is accurate, then the phone number that's presented on this flight booking information is more likely than not accurate as well.
Just to clarify, the name on that flight booking, what was the name on that flight booking information?
The name on the flight booking was Logan Clegg.
Lieutenant, did the police ultimately request a search warrant for information related to that phone from Verizon?
Yes, we did.
When did you do that?
We did that in December.
How long did it take for Verizon to provide results once they were provided with that search warrant?
Approximately 3 weeks.
One moment, please, Your Honor. Received information that indicated to you that that phone was not associated with Logan Clegg or that it was associated with someone else, what would you have done?
Cease and desist,
Why is that?
because that phone number was our only means, tangible means, credible means to actually take action and track him. This other information could have been booked from anywhere in the country, but that phone number was actionable and tangible and led us to a location.
Along that same line, when you received those Greyhound records on October 3rd about a bus trip from Boston and ultimately to Burlington by someone named Arthur Kelly, why didn't you make an exigency request at that point?
There was nothing to request. We followed up with all viable means based on what we know to be his pattern of life. And again, we requested the footage from both bus stations to see if the person who represented to be Arthur Kelly on that bus was in fact the defendant. And all of those means came back to nothing. So there was nothing for us to do a search warrant for or request information beyond for. So although, as I discussed before, I believe that by definition it was exigent to locate the killer of Just Wendy and Steve and Reid, simply having an Arthur Kelly leaving Boston and going to Burlington, Vermont did not mean that that Arthur Kelly had anything to do with our homicides, although being, I believe, diligent like we were, we did all things that we could to either rule in or rule out that it was in fact Logan Kelly that had transported or had traveled to Burlington at that time.
You mean Logan Clegg?
Yes, I'm sorry. I mistook on that.
No more questions, Ron.
So, Attorney
I-
May, it's up to you. I'm sorry, did you want to ask?
No, the bus ticket was under Arthur Kelly, and that's why I said that.
Okay, so it's up to you. Do you want
I
go for a
can
few-
get started and then I'll do a
Yeah,
quick
at some,
chapter.
at some point,
lunch.
right around 12:30, because I want to make sure everybody has a break too. So
Absolutely.
right around 12:30, that'd be great.
Okay. There's been a lot of talk about a murder weapon. You testified that you collected a gun from Mr. Clegg. Not you personally, but the police collected a gun from Mr. Clegg.
That's correct.
And you testified that the gun matched casings found at the murder scene. You used the word murder scene. Yes?
That's correct.
All right, so those casings, they were found in the woods, and we have a map of it up here.
Yes.
right? And if I may approach, Your Honor.
Absolutely.
So you have it labeled here as crime scene, and then there's a second star further into the woods. So the bodies were recovered at the second star further into the woods,
Yes, ma'am.
and there had been, I believe, a bullet with genetic material found at this place where the first star is.
In addition to blood and whatnot.
Okay. Those things were found immediately within the first day or so of discovering the bodies.
Yes.
All right. And when the police set up this scene, there's certain protocols that you follow. Yes?
Yes.
So, for instance, you put up crime scene tape.
Yes.
And the reason for that is you don't want people going into the area.
That's correct.
You keep a log of all the officers who enter that area.
Yes.
And that's because you want to know everyone who was present.
Yes.
And in fact, this scene was open for more than 24 hours.
Yes, it was.
And so
Well, I want to rephrase that. It was not open for 24
I
hours.
apologize. It was an active crime scene for over 24 hours.
Yes.
Where officers were present
Yes.
and officers didn't leave.
That is correct.
So at some point in the middle of the night, there's an officer standing there with the sole purpose of making sure that no one enters that area.
There were two officers there, standing there.
So
Yes.
there were two officers there standing guard to make sure that no one else is going into this area.
Correct.
Because this area is a park.
Yes, it is.
It's a public park.
Yes.
It's a well-visited public park.
It sure is.
In fact, almost every single time that officers were out there, they saw hikers,
I don't know.
they saw mountain bikers.
I don't know.
Certainly every time you've been out there, you saw hikers
Yes.
and you've seen mountain bikers.
Maybe not every single time, but I've been out there frequently, and I frequently have come across people using the trails recreationally.
All right, so we will agree that it is a frequently used recreational public trail.
Agreed.
All right, and so you have the two officers standing guard, and while they're standing guard, you have several officers coming into that area.
Yes.
The taped off area.
Yes.
You have other people that work for the state, such as the ME, the medical examiner.
Yes.
You have people who are collecting evidence,
Correct.
taking photographs,
Yes.
and searching for evidence.
Yes.
That is essentially what the purpose of that is to search for evidence.
Yes.
Now, that genetic material that we talked about on the bullet, this was directly in front of a very large tree on the trail.
The bullet that was found later on,
Nope, I'm talking about the bullet that was found while the scene was still active,
okay.
on the trail. The fragment, bullet fragment.
Okay, there was a bullet fragments, there were bullet fragments found on that trail in that particular spot, yes.
All right, those were in front of a large tree.
Yes.
Now, you've talked about the casings that were found later on.
Yes.
They were found on May 20th.
Yes.
Now, we talked about how this scene was, you had two officers, 24/7, around the clock, were at that scene.
Yes.
But that only lasted so long. Right?
Yes.
You're not still there right now.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
So that scene closed out on April 23rd at 3:37 p.m. That was when it was released.
Yes.
And so during that time, you talked about some people, officers, there were also not just police officers, but canine officers. that had gone into that area
Yes,
and looked for evidence.
yes.
And there's different types of canine officers.
Yes, sir.
There's some canine officers or canines that specialize in locating bullets.
Yes,
There are some canines that specialize in locating electronics.
yes,
And the police also had the use of metal detectors, correct?
correct.
Prior to April 23rd, all of those things happened within that active roped-off crime scene.
That is correct.
Now, the crime scene, because there were things on the trail, that included that large tree.
Yes, a large tree was on the side of the trail.
All right, so that area was thoroughly searched.
And I don't want to confuse that large tree that we're talking about with the large tree that the bodies were found behind.
Right, I'm not talking about the bodies, I'm talking about on the trail.
Yes, okay.
All right, so as of the 23rd, all of these different people had searched the area
Yes,
and the dogs
yes.
and metal detectors.
I do not know if metal detectors had been out at that point in time. I will defer to you on that. If you're saying that they were, I recall going out there on multiple occasions with metal detectors.
All right, so prior to April 23rd, prior to that scene closing, casings had not been found around that tree.
That is correct.
And we just talked about how that area is kept guarded with the two officers. You've talked about a burnt tent site,
I did.
and that at no point was fully guarded, closed off.
Correct, negative, was not.
All right, so up until April 23rd, these had not yet been found. But even though the scene was closed, you all continued to investigate.
Of course,
You continued to search.
yes,
You continued to go out to the crime scene.
yes,
Officers went out there on April 25th. They did a walkthrough with Miss Nan Nutt.
yes,
Officers went out there, different officers went out there on the 25th to set up a trail camera.
yes,
The fire marshal went out there with a dog to look for ignitable smells.
yes,
Even though, I'm gonna back up, I apologize. On April 26th, the officers went to the burnt tent site.
I know at least one did, yes,
And they went with another potential witness, Stephen Hatcher.
yes,
On that date, officers Harbitz and Ryder also went to the scene to deal with malfunctions with the camera.
I know, if it was that date, then I'll agree with you. I know that they went out at some point in time to deal with malfunctions with one of the cameras.
On April 26th, Detective Brown walked the trails.
On April 26th, you said?
Yes.
Yes.
Officers Ryder and Harbitz went out again on May 4th to set up more of these cameras.
I don't know the date, but I know that they did go out at some point in time, once that one that had malfunctioned and we had acquired a replacement.
On May 5th, officers went out to walk the trail and to take, walking time measurements.
Again, I don't know the date. I know that that did occur.
On May 5th, police brought tech sniffing dogs to the area, to different areas within the park.
Again, without knowing the specific date, I know that that did occur as well.
On May 10th, several officers went out to do a recreation.
Yes, I was present for that.
Okay, so you're present for that. And this process, you all brought some weighted dummies with you.
Yes, that I acquired from the Concord Fire Department.
And Detective Brown basically tried to recreate what they thought perhaps happened to the Reeds.
What we recreated was not exactly what happened to the Reeds, but we knew the drag trail. We knew that the Reeds had been dragged. We knew where they had been dragged from, and we recreated the drag.
And so you attempted to recreate this, what you just described.
Correct.
And when you did this, you didn't shut down the park.
No, we did not.
So people were still walking around.
No one walked by at that time.
No one walked by at that time?
No.
So on May 10th, police also did a walkthrough with the city forester.
That I'm unaware of.
On May 12th, Detective Ryder went out with a metal detector.
Detective Ryder alone?
On May 12th, another walkthrough was done with a different witness, Alan Schwartz.
Again, not knowing the date, I know Alan Schwartz did a walkthrough, yes.
You would agree that happened prior to May 20th?
Yes.
On May 17th is when the Attorney General's office publicly released a sketch.
I don't know the exact date. I know a sketch was publicly released in that time frame.
So all of these people have gone through this public area, and it is not until May 20th that these casings are found.
That is correct.
And the casings, the only thing that they match is casings found at a burnt tent site.
And ultimately, the gun in the possession of Logan Clegg, yes.
Okay, so the only things that they match up to are casings at the burnt tent site and Mr. Clegg's gun.
Correct.
There is no indication that they match any of the bullets that were recovered from the bodies of the Reids. They do not match.
I think it's more complicated than that.
There is no match. It was inconclusive.
The rounds had lands and grooves that were recovered from the bodies.
You're not a ballistics expert.
Objection, can he answer?
He's got, he wants to explain his answer. I'm going to allow it. Please continue, Lieutenant.
The rounds that were recovered from both the scene and the bodies had similar characteristics, class characteristics of a 9mm Luger round.
All right, so they had class characteristics, but there is no specific match to that gun.
Ballistically correct.
Ballistically correct?
Ballistically correct.
That is correct.
I'm not a ballistics expert. They had similar class characteristics to that gun.
It was not a match. You said you're not an expert.
You're saying
Experts
you're-
did not mean
Your
a
Honor.
match.
She's badgering him, gotta let him answer.
I think if allow the question if you want to respond.
I think I did respond. I'm satisfied with the answer. I'm not a ballistics expert, and as far as I know, that the bullets matched similar class characteristics, and you're stating something that I'm just simply not going to agree to because I'm not a ballistics expert.
So the casings that were found on May 20th, those were not found by you?
No,
You didn't find those?
I did not.
Those were actually found by an attorney?
Yes,
An attorney working for the AG's office?
yes. When you say found, I'll say that they were visually observed by them and then collected by us while we were present, while officers were present.
Sure. When this attorney observed them, this was not after any manipulation of that area?
At that moment in time,
Looking around,
he was not.
he walked up to that tree that we talked about, that large tree on the trail near where the fragments and genetic material were found.
Yes.
He walked up and he said, "What is that?"
I don't know his exact words, but to the effect, I'm tracking what you're saying, and the essence of what you're saying is true, yes.
So they were just out there in plain view.
They were out there and visible to him, to where he pointed them out.
All right, so talking a little bit about the burnt site trail, or the burnt site camp.
Yes,
You had also found casings there.
yes.
Many of those casings were also just visually apparent. Not all, but many.
I will disagree with that statement.
You didn't collect all of the casings from the burnt tent site until after May 20th.
We did not collect all the shell cases till after May 20th. That's correct.
this a logical time for us to break?
I believe so.
So when we break, I know it's a little bit past 12:30. If we could resume close to 1:30, that'd be great. That'd be really good. Thank you.
Rise before.
Let me just check. Are the things that I'm doing by WebEx so that council can leave their papers at table? Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So the answer is yes, you can leave your stuff.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Am I dismissed from?
Yeah, just step down. What is it, recess?
We'll be back.
1:30. Let's go talk real quick. Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
I have no clue because I don't do a thing with it, but I went around and asked the office, did I get it? So.